Hi, my name is Eric Frank. I'm co-founder and CEO of Acrobatiq, and my goal today is to provide you with an overview of what Acrobatiq, powered by Carnegie Mellon, is all about. It's always good to start with a little tour into our past. We're a unique entity in that we're a fully owned for-profit subsidiary of Carnegie Mellon University. We come out of a long and storied tradition of work in the area of education technology and cognitive science as a result of that relationship. Specifically, think about Carnegie Mellon. It has this long-term expertise in cognitive science, human-computer interaction and user experience, software engineering, and statistics and statistical modeling. All of that came together in 2001 in an applied research project that many in the education community have viewed as a real pioneer in the field of online learning, and that was the Open Learning Initiative. We're a direct relation to the Open Learning Initiative. The Open Learning Initiative was really started to ask the question, can we apply what we know about how people learn to measurably improve learning outcomes online? That was the fundamental driving research question behind OLI, and I think after 12 years of research, the answer to that question was yes. Just some quick numbers. It was a 12-year project, over 100 faculty at 55 institutions involved in the research. Over $20 million in research funding went into OLI from entities like the National Science Foundation, the Gates Foundation, the Hewlett Foundation, and others. And over 1 million learners went through Open Learning Initiative courses, including over 150,000 who were enrolled in formally matriculated programs and using Open Learning Initiative courseware as their primary learning resource instead of a textbook. The results were more important than the numbers. There were over 20 published papers over the 12 years demonstrating in different ways, shapes, and forms improved learning outcomes. Most importantly, they demonstrated that students were actually attaining increased learning gains as evidenced by the gains between pre and post tests, and they were learning more in less time, generally somewhere in the neighborhood of 65 to 70% of the time on task that it was taking students in traditional courses. And these kinds of results were replicated across multiple segments: private, higher education institutions, four-year public institutions, and over 26 community colleges. Just to give you a sense of that research was saying, there was a series of studies done on a statistics course created by OLI. And the first study was around whether accelerated learning was taking place. It measured an adaptive data-driven OLI course against a traditional college course, first at Carnegie Mellon. And the results were pretty astounding, that students in the traditional course were taking more than 100 hours of time to complete the work of the course, and were only attaining a 3% learning gain in that course. The students in the control section at OLI were spending less than 50 hours in the course and attaining an 18% learning gain. Similar results were then replicated 3 times at Carnegie Mellon and then externally in a report authored by the Ithaca Foundation. Maybe more interestingly was the second follow-on study, which said, well, if students are learning more and faster, how are they doing with this information in the future? And so there was a retention study. And again, if you looked at the group on the right, the traditional control versus the OLI adaptive group, the OLI adaptive group, after 6 months, actually demonstrated a statistically significant way that they were retaining the information more effectively than the traditional group when taking a new post-test. Both groups took the post-test, and the OLI students outperformed again. And then maybe the most interesting study was the third one, which was, okay, so you learned more, you learned it faster, you remembered it better, but could you actually transfer the knowledge of what you learned to a new context? And again, when given a new problem to solve which required the knowledge from statistics, the students in the OLI group outperformed the traditional control group. All that was really saying you can learn more, you can learn it faster, you can remember it better, and ultimately you can transfer it more effectively, so the learning was demonstrated to be highly robust. It was really on top of that foundation that Carnegie Mellon University decided to launch a formal for-profit entity to scale the impact of OLI called Acrobatiq. We started in June of 2013. Our goals really are simply to accelerate and scale the impact of OLI globally and ultimately to build a sustainable business for Carnegie Mellon University. We started again in 2013 with funding exclusively from Carnegie Mellon University. And over the first 18 months of the business, some of the key achievements were that we rebuilt the platform. So while we had excellent science, methodology, and algorithms, the technology itself had gotten old, and we wanted to make sure we had a modern, scalable, cloud-based architecture and platform. And so we rebuilt the platform from scratch. That's allowed us to dramatically accelerate the time to develop courseware. It was taking several years. We now take less than 5 months, and significantly decrease the cost of producing that courseware based on this better technology. We've got over 35 universities now using courseware developed by Acrobatiq. And we're seeing some continued strong outcomes results. In our first significant amount of data across 5 courses at one online learning institution, we were seeing pass rates increase between 18 and 26%. The aggregate across the courses was a 23% increase in pass rates. And recently, in October 2014, we were awarded a prestigious Gates Foundation Courseware Challenge Award to continue to innovate on top of that foundation of OLI. So with that background, what is Acrobatiq all about going forward? At high level, our goal is to make the world smarter through personalized learning at scale. And what we really do specifically is we try to optimize learning outcomes through 2 products. One is courseware. This is where we take our methodology, our technology, and our ability to develop courseware on top of that, and we build a complete courseware solution. You can think of courseware probably most easily as a replacement for a textbook and assignments that might take place in a course. It doesn't necessarily replace a course, doesn't necessarily have to replace a lecture component of a course, but it generally is the work that students will be doing away from a classroom, reading, solving problems, doing projects, all embedded in a cohesive and integrated solution, which I'll talk more about. In fall of 2015, we're also releasing a second product, which is to separate content that we produce from the platform we use to produce it and make that platform and a set of services available to universities so that they can directly produce their own online courseware using our methodology and adaptive courseware development tools and technology. So ultimately, we'll have both courseware that one can adopt and adapt to local circumstances, or a platform that one can use to produce courseware locally. I'm going to spend the bulk of the remaining time talking about the key capabilities that sit underneath Acrobatiq and that are embedded in this highly scalable cloud-hosted platform that I talked about. Those 3 key capabilities are, number 1, an outcomes-based architecture, an approach to structuring a course to focus on the things students should know and be able to do when the course is finished. The second thing is learning science-based design, to take what we know about how people learn from cognitive science and turn those into design principles on which we build all of our courseware. And number 3, data-driven learning optimization, the ability to collect, model, and then use data as students interact with the courseware to continuously optimize the learning outcomes in a whole number of ways that I'll talk about in detail and show you some examples of. At a high level, let me describe the platform that sits underneath the courseware. There's a suite of authoring applications. This is where one can develop a graph of all of the outcomes that are desired in the course, and we'll talk about that. And then one can produce all of the rich content of a course, from text to images to video to a library of different types of problems and activities, and then connect those 2 things together so that every activity, every question is tied to a specific outcome through the technology. Then, when it's ready, we are able to deliver that as a cohesive learning experience inside of an adaptive and mobile learning environment. This is where students will interact with the courseware in a cloud-hosted environment. It's fully mobile responsive, so students can consume courseware on any device, and I'll describe what I mean when I say that it is adaptive, because that is a buzzword that commonly means very little these days. As students are interacting with the courseware, we're collecting uh, engagement data and learning data about that student's interactions. I'll get into this in some substantial detail shortly, but at a high level, we're collecting the data, we're modeling the data, and then we're using the data in a whole number of ways. We're measuring student engagement, and we're trying to see how they're doing against all the desired outcomes of the course so that we can do a number of things. One, we can actually personalize the content. So once we know that a student is weak, for example, on a particular outcome, we might be able to give that student more practice against that outcome than another student. So the environment itself can adapt based on the knowledge we have about the student from the inference engine. We can also export this knowledge in the form of dashboards. We can let faculty know who's struggling, what are they struggling with, what learning objectives are students doing well on, which ones are they doing poorly on. We can let students know how well they're doing. We can let them know how well they're doing against their goal. Let's say they say, I want to take 6 weeks to finish this course. We can let them know how they're doing against that goal, for example. And we can also publish out all of that data for our institutional university partners in a whole host of different ways, not just dashboards, but in raw data through APIs so that institutions can get that data into their institutional research groups and model the data in their own ways. And then critically, we also have built A/B testing tools and other things to allow performance data to drive the next generation of authoring. So if we know there's an area of a course where a student is underperforming, we can test new approaches and we can ultimately continuously improve the courseware based on data. And importantly, all of this platform is intended to integrate into an LMS. It can be used standalone, but generally we assume that most of our customers will have an LMS and they'll want to continue to use that LMS for enrolling students, for capturing grades, but they may want to have students seamlessly move back and forth between the LMS and our environment for different parts of the course experience. And we are designed from the get-go to interoperate inside of all of the common LMSs. So let's get into a little bit more detail on each of these key capabilities. The first one being outcomes-based architecture. So by this I mean simply that we start with defining what students should know and be able to do at the end of a particular course. We then design all of the instructional content, whether it's exposition, multimedia, to facilitate active student learning against those outcomes. And then we produce practice, formative, and summative assessment that gets embedded throughout the course so that students can ensure that they are practicing and being assessed against each of those outcomes. And we have all of this sort of captured in a tight triangle. Now we do this in a particular way that we call a skill graph. We literally produce a graphical output of the relationship between all of the outcomes. And I want to talk a little bit about why this is so important and valuable, and it'll come back when we talk about how we collect and model data shortly. So I'm going to give you an example of a typical learning objective in our biology course, and this is typical of most courses. So here is an example. Recognize the difference between ATP and ADP in terms of structure and energy. Turns out that there are actually 4 discrete outcomes involved in this one learning objective. A student has to know what ATP is. That's one specific sub-outcome of this learning objective. They have to know what ADP is, a second outcome. They actually have to be able to recognize the difference. This is yet a third skill. And then the fourth skill is that they have to recognize that difference in the context of a larger construct in the course of structure and energy. And so there are really 4 specific skills tied to this learning objective. There's the learning objective, recognize the difference between ATP and ADP in terms of structure and energy. And then there are 4 specific skills tied to that. Describe ATP and ADP, describe ADP structure and function, differentiate between them, and do that in the context of structure and energy. And we capture all of the relationship, and then for each individual skill mapped to a learning objective, we tie each of the content that instructs or assesses against that skill to that skill. And so we begin to build, in essence, a graphical view of all of the outcomes. In reality, while this is a simple one-to-many type of relationship, it's very often a many-to-many type of relationship where one skill might relate to multiple learning objectives, etc. And outcomes can be mapped at multiple levels of hierarchy. I just showed you a 2-level map, which is a learning objective to the underlying skills. Most of our courses are built as 4-level maps. We actually have a set of high-level outcomes of a course. You can call it a competency or a key outcome. And for example, here's one in cell biology. You can analyze different types of cells based on structure and functions. There's a number of sub-goals or building blocks that we call learning goals that make up the building blocks of being able to do that. One of them, for example, this one, is analyze cell processes. That's something amongst other things you have to be able to do to analyze different types of cells based on structure and biological function. Well, that particular learning goal has a number of learning objectives that are sub-goals of being able to analyze cell processes. One of those learning objectives is explain the functional difference between somatic cells and gametes. That's one of many learning objectives necessary in order to be able to analyze cell processes. And that learning objective has 3 particular skills related to it. One of those is describe different types of cells. And so you can see that we can get down to ultimately a very specific set of relationships where we understand the most discrete and smallest measurable unit of knowledge, the skill that relates to the next level up and then all the way up to the competencies of the course. Ultimately, that gets captured in our technology, and you can see one of the graphical outputs from that here. Here's that competency we were looking at. You can analyze different types of cells based on structure and biological function. It's related to that particular learning goal, amongst others, of analyzing cell processes. Here's one of the multiple objectives that relate to that, explain the functional difference between somatic cells and gametes, and that is in turn related to those 3 skills. I used the example earlier of describe different types of cells. Now what you see on the right is an actual page of content from the course, and we're going to go look at a page in the live environment in a moment. But I wanted to point out the tight relationship now between the outcomes in the graph and the content of the course. So for example, here you can see that there's a learning objective, explain the functional differences between somatic cells and gametes in the graph. Well, that exact objective is specified to the student on this page of content. Explain the functional differences between somatic cells and gametes. The student's then going to do some reading against that learning objective. And down here, they're going to stop and do some practice problems, including the second one, eggs and sperms are what types of cells? Well, it turns out that that practice problem relates directly to this particular skill, which relates to this particular objective, which relates to this particular learning goal and to this key outcome or competency. And so we have this tight relationship between content and the outcomes, but also we're able to capture data against the outcomes and use that data to get a sense of how students are doing against higher order outcomes as well. We're also building authoring tools to make this easy for end users. So when I said an institution could build its own courses, simply using web tools, and then when they're building a problem, use drop-down menus to do their own tying of that problem to that particular skill through very simple tools that we'll be providing. The second key capability that I wanted to talk about today was learning science-based design. We now know what the outcomes are, we've mapped the course, we've got it all ready to tie it together. We need content. And when we build content for our courseware, we take what we know about how people learn, and we use that to design all of our courseware. Here are some very basic principles. When I say principles from learning science, I mean things like students do better when they work towards clear goals. Students learn by doing, so we have to provide opportunities for them to do, not just to be passive learners. Students benefit from practice, and when they practice, they benefit from getting targeted feedback. That is, feedback targeted to the specific mistakes that the student's making, so that every practice opportunity becomes a learning opportunity. And then finally, they benefit from the ability to synthesize what they're learning at lower levels and apply that to higher levels, whether it's higher orders of Bloom's taxonomy or whether it's taking those skills at the lowest level and synthesizing them and applying them to something like a key outcome or a competency of the course. These are just a handful of the types of things that we design into our courses consistently, but I wanted to give you a sort of a sense. I'm going to take you into the actual course environment, show you a couple things, and I'll show you these goals, for example, at work on a single page of the course so you can get a feel for the student learning experience. So I'm going to take us to a course page, and here I've got a couple courses queued up. I'm going to go to our Introduction to Biology course, and we'll start off by going to the table of contents. You'll see a couple of things, and I'll be coming back to some of this, but there's a learning dashboard. This is a high-level view for students of how they're doing against each of the competencies of the course. And then we'll move here to a table of contents. Typical structure of a course is to include units. Each unit includes modules, and each module is built around key learning goals. So for example, Module 20 on mitosis is built around two particular goals: describe the stages of the cell cycle and explain the roles of mitosis and meiosis. Again, students can see their progress. These colors mean different levels of progress for students against each of the outcomes, but we'll come back to that. The other thing I want to point out before we dive onto a page is that for each unit we also build a pretest so students can pre-assess, so we can get a sense of whether what they know and what they don't know against the key outcomes for that unit. And you'll also see that there's a unit test. So at the end of each unit, we provide a summative assessment. And what we are able to do as we measure data from students' interaction with the content in a unit is we can indicate to them through an indicator when we believe they're ready to go out and take that summative unit test. So if you're in a self-paced course, and this isn't only for self-paced courses by any means, a student can move faster by knowing when it is that they're ready to go on and take the unit test based on their performance. What I want to focus on, though, simply is a single page of a course, so you can get a sense of the learning experience. So we're going to go to Unit 6, Cell Division, Module 20, Mitosis. Here, just to get us sort of anchored on where we are, we're in Unit 6, Cell Division, Module 20, Mitosis. And these are the key topics that we're going to be studying in mitosis, each topic covered on a page. We'll go to the first one, what is mitosis? So you can see that first goal I talked about, students benefit from clear goals. Well, here every single page of the course says this is what you should know or be able to do when you're finished with this page. So the student knows that they have to describe the purpose of mitosis in each of its phases. In this particular page, the student will do some reading. They can certainly get things like pop-up definitions of all of the key terms. They see some images. I'll point out, as I mentioned earlier, that our platform is mobile and adaptive. It's also Section 508 compliant. So every image has alternate tags that can be read by screen readers for students who have print disabilities, for example. But I think the key is they've done a little bit of reading, and then here they immediately stop, and we embed over 1,000 activities or questions like this throughout a courseware experience for a student. Here they're doing one of 25 different types of questions available in our platform. They range from true, false, multiple choice, open-ended responses, numeric responses in mathematics, clickable image maps, interactive timelines for history courses. This is a very simple question type. We call it a submit and compare. So students ask what role does mitosis play in the overall cell cycle, and they can type their answer here into this box and submit it, and immediately are given the response of an expert. And they can go ahead and compare their response to the response of an expert, and we ask them some questions to guide their thinking and their comparison as they go through. Then they'll continue to do a little bit more reading, as you can see here. And here's an example of turning a student into a more active learner. And so rather than just giving them an image with labels on it, we're asking them to build that image itself. We're using open content, in this case, prepared by the University of Maryland, and integrating it into the courseware. This is a simple interactive where the student will prepare the structure of a cell for build a cell prepared for mitosis. So they're following the instructions on the right, and they're simply drawing this out. They can get some feedback, so if I try to place these centrioles in the wrong place, for example, it says your placement of the centrioles has them inside the nuclear envelope. They should be outside. Try again. So I can go ahead and correct that mistake. I can place the chromatids where I believe they belong. And now, through that simple act of being more engaged and active, it's likely that my retention of that information will be stronger than if I had simply looked at a static image. And then the heart of the matter is, immediately after the student does that active learning activity, we're going to stop and ask them a series of 3 questions about that. So you see the first of 3 questions here. You can see that there are 3. And as the students are answering these questions, we're giving them feedback targeting the mistakes that they're making. So if this student, for example, selects an incorrect response, chromosomes, we're not only telling them that it's incorrect, but we're telling them exactly why, that the chromosomes are contained inside the nucleus. The inner circle represents the nuclear envelope, that is the membrane surrounding and protecting the chromosome. So that wrong answer was an opportunity to not only practice, but to actually formatively learn. As students get correct answers, we also reinforce those correct answers with why they're correct to reinforce the learning. The student can go on to the second part of this activity and then the third part. The other thing I'll point out here is that for every question we embed, we also provide multiple levels of hints. So we want a student to have an efficient learning experience here. So if they're struggling with this, we want to allow them to ask for a hint. And our first level of hint is always a soft nudge. If they're still struggling, they see that there's an arrow for a second level of hint. This will give them a little bit stronger of a push towards the response. And in this case, there happens to be a third level, which will give the student the strongest push towards the correct answer without actually answering the question for the student. So this just gives you an example of a single page of a course that's pretty typical of what our course experiences look like in some of those principles of learning that I talked about at work. Now I want to focus on the third and maybe most unique aspect or key capability of our courseware, and that is data-driven learning optimization. So what do I mean by this? Well, as students are interacting with our courseware, we're capturing a lot of data. There's a lot of talk about data these days, but most institutions are capturing institutional data, students progressing from course A to course B. They can sort that by demographics of those students, etc. And there are more platforms, particularly learning management systems, that are also capturing engagement data. Engagement data tends to measure the behavior of a student. Did they log in? When? How frequently did they log in? When they're logged into the course, what objects did they click? How long did they spend there? And all of that is useful information and can be modeled in different ways, but it's still a proxy for what we want to know. The student's behavior is a proxy for what we really want to know, which is the student learning? What are they learning and what are they not learning? And at what level of learning? Because this is ultimately the essence of what a student is trying to do, is to learn. And so we're capturing both engagement types of data and learning data. And I'll describe what I mean by learning data. So because we have so many practice opportunities embedded in a course for a student, we're able to measure with a fairly precise degree of accuracy what the learning level is, or the learning state of that student against each of the outcomes. We can gather information such as they got a problem against an outcome right, they got it wrong. Did they get it right or wrong the first time, the second time, or the third time? Did they ask for a hint? Did they not ask for a hint? How long did they spend when they were trying to solve that problem? All of these become observable inputs into our modeling. But we're also going well beyond that to model what we call cognitive factors. So if all we measured was what I just talked about a minute ago, we would be measuring accuracy or precision. How accurate is a student when they're solving problems? But that's not really necessarily all that learning is about. We also know that, for example, things like learning decay happen. So a student might be accurate today, and 18 weeks from today in their second course, the level of learning around that objective may have decayed. We know that factors like individual student rates of learning matter. Over time, we might want to be able to reduce the amount of evidence required from a student who has a consistently high rate of learning versus a student who has a consistently lower rate of learning, and we want to continue to ask that student to give us more evidence of learning. Learning curve analysis is a cognitive factor. The pattern in which students get answers correct or incorrect makes a difference. That's what we call the learning curve. So if we have two different students, they both get, let's say, 7 problems right against 10 problems available against a single outcome of a course. But the first student made most of their mistakes early and then got their problems towards the tail end of those 10 correct. We would look at that as a tutor, for example, and say that that student is demonstrating a smooth and expected learning curve. Let's take the second student, who also gets 7 out of 10 right, but gets the last 3 wrong. If you were a tutor and you watched that student solve those problems and get the last 3 wrong, you would be much more hesitant to consider that student at the same level as the first student. And that is exactly what our model does, is it weights those two students differently based on that learning curve analysis. There are a number of additional factors, but the main point here is that we're gathering data and we're measuring in a sophisticated way in order to try to generate a single, really critical prediction. We're trying to predict that at any one moment, what is the level of learning or the learning state of each student against each of the outcomes of the course. And what we're specifically trying to predict is if we gave a student a bank of problems against a particular objective, such as this one, what is the likelihood that they'll be able to get it consistently correct without help? And if they are able to do that, we would say in our system that the student has achieved a high learning state or a green coded state. If a student would be able to get the problems right, but not consistently and not without some help from time to time, then we are predicting that their learning state is moderate. If a student is unable, we predict that the student would be unable to consistently solve those correctly and would frequently need help. Then we predict that the student has a low or red learning state. And if the student hasn't done enough work in the system, we would see a gray state, or we are unable to make your prediction because you haven't done enough work as a student. Once we know what, or we can predict what the student's learning state is against each of the outcomes of the course, now is where we can start to use that information, that student learning data, to optimize the learning of that student through different stakeholders in the activities of those stakeholders. We can help instructors do what they do more effectively. We can help course designers make changes to the courses more effectively and drive better outcomes in the future. We can help students directly focus on the things they need to focus on and therefore optimize their learning. And we can help administrators make better administrative decisions over time. I want to give you just a couple of examples, and we'll go into live parts of the platform to do this, to show you what I mean by data-driven learning optimization. I'm going to start with the instructor. Instructor optimization loop that I want to focus on are dashboards. And so we can provide the instructor. I'm going to go here to courses I'm teaching as an instructor. And let's switch gears from biology to survey of world history. And I'm going to go to a learning dashboard. And what the modeled data is able to do for instructors is to answer questions that instructors may have about their class or about their students or about their content in order to help them instruct more effectively based on having visibility that they have not historically had. So for example, we talked about that behavioral or engagement data. We collect and model that. So we can tell faculty, for example, or tutors or mentors or others, how often are students logging in? Which students have practiced the least based on how much activity they've done. And we can give that data in all kinds of different ways. I'll just give a quick example. So how often are students logging in? I can click in here. I can get the data. I can look at it by a particular session. I can look at it by a particular time. I want to see how often they log in today, over the last week, from the beginning of the course. Maybe I just want to see how often one particular student logs in. These are all fictitious students, but maybe I just want to check on Katie Bartlett because I'm specifically concerned about her level of engagement in the course. I'm also able to see the data in this visualized format, but I can also output it into CSV, Excel, PDF. I can print it. I can sort it in different ways, but I'm able to basically see for example, who's logging in, who's not logging in all kinds of different ways that make it convenient. Some of the more interesting views of the data, though, are the ones that combine engagement with learning data. So for example, what if I want to know how well the students are learning in my class, or who's struggling and isn't learning very much and might need some kind of intervention. So here, for example, we can see students plotted against the learning objectives of the course. And so the vertical axis, or I should say the horizontal axis, is showing the level of activities that each of the students in the course have completed as of this moment. And the vertical axis is actually showing their learning state or their learning estimate. This is actually their learning, this is their behavior. And so what's interesting about this kind of view is, one, we can quickly see all the students who haven't done anything yet. That's one type of intervention that we might want to design around that. But more importantly, maybe we can see some interesting results. So for example, if we were only looking at engagement data, we might look at this student, Elizabeth Garola, and we might say that Elizabeth's doing great. She's very active. She's at the front of the pack of the course in terms of completing activities. And we wouldn't know that in reality, Elizabeth's learning state is increasing very little, which is even more worrisome given how much work she's done. Elizabeth may be the most at-risk student in this class at this moment and needs assistance. And we can know that about Elizabeth before we've historically known that, which is when she gets to some kind of a test, a midterm or a final exam, and there we learn that while she's been engaged, she hasn't been actually learning. I'll give you one more example of a view of data that might be useful, which is, for example, what learning objectives are students having difficulty with? Why might I want to know this? Well, I might give a lecture on Monday, and maybe I'm going to see those same students again on Wednesday, and I want to know in the module they worked on between Monday and Wednesday, are they having any trouble? And I might want to address, if they are, that trouble spot in my lecture in the first 5 minutes of class on Wednesday. So for example, here I can see that the learning objectives students have struggled the most with during this period were identifying Greece on a map and describing how geographic and environmental factors influence the development, growth, and sustainability of Greek civilization. I can not only see that this is the most troublesome learning objective over this time period, but I can also see who's struggling. So within that particular cohort, I can see the group of students who have struggled with it. I can see the group of students who haven't done any work yet against that objective, etc. And the dashboards are designed for faculty to be able to use them the way that they see fit. So they can move these dashboard views around. You can delete any dashboard view you don't care about. You can add new dashboard views of questions that we didn't look at. For example, what activities are students having difficulty with, etc. All of this, again, designed to optimize student learning through providing visibility to the faculty themselves. I'm going to give another example of data-driven learning optimization, and this is for the student themselves. One quick example would be student dashboards, which are being released in the summer of 2015. These give students the ability to see, for example, where they are in the course, where they need to go next, how many stars representing the level of learning, of the learning state of the student against a particular set of objectives. They can see in this module what they've completed and what they haven't completed. And they can get more nuanced views. For example, here's a listing of places where they have 1 or 0 stars, meaning their learning state is low. And this provides an opportunity for them, for example, to study very efficiently for maybe an upcoming assessment. Here we give the student a chance to identify how long they would like to take to complete the course. Maybe it's a traditional 15-week course. Maybe they want to try to complete it in 12. And then we can allow them to see how well they're doing against that goal as they work. I also want to show an example of the system adapting to 2 different students with 2 different learning states. And so we're going to go back into the platform. And this time I'm going to open up 2 different browsers. At the end of every module, we have a personal practice session. We now know something about that student and their level of learning or their learning state against the key outcomes of the module. And what we want to do is design a practice session at the end of the module to help prepare them for the unit test that's coming at the end of the unit. But not every student needs to prepare in the same way because they're not all at the same learning level or learning state. And so a personal practice session is one that adapts to each individual's learning state. You can see the student on the left has attained a high level of mastery against the 2 outcomes in Module 20. The student on the right has attained a much lower level of mastery. And therefore, as these 2 students enter this practice session, they're both going to have different experiences. This particular practice session is made up of a series. All of these represent pages the student is going to work through, and it's an ongoing scenario in which they're applying the concepts of mitosis to cancer. And so what we want every student to be able to do is to answer the types of questions that will be on the unit assessment that represent the type of knowledge we want every student to have. But what we know is they're not all similarly prepared. So the student on the left, we're only asking one question about this particular image. It's the type of question that will be on the unit assessment. The student on the reason we're only asking one is because we predict that this student can answer that question. We want to verify it, that our prediction is correct, and let them move on as quickly as possible. This student with the lower learning state, we predict, is not prepared to answer that question. And so they have the same question. In this case, it's question 3. It's the same question as over here. But we predict the 2 specific skills that the student is still struggling with, and we want to give them some additional practice and targeted feedback against those skills before they get to this particular question. This is because we predict they're not ready, and we want to build up their skills and build up their confidence to be able to do this question and then move on. And you can see that the experience between these 2 different students with different learning states continues to differentiate as they go through this practice experience. This student, again, is getting one question about this image, and then they're being asked to answer it because we predict they can. This student is getting that same question. It's now question 6, but before that, they're getting a whole series of additional questions targeting skills that they're struggling with. This is an example of an adaptive environment which the system is adapting to the learning state of the individual student. I want to give you one final example of the use of data to optimize student learning. And this is one that's in process now, a series of tools that will be releasing in the fall of 2015. And this is aimed at both faculty and or instructional designers, anybody responsible for ongoing maintenance of course content and improvement of course content. We think data can play a huge role in improving the course in very targeted ways towards the places where students are struggling. So here's an example of a different view. It's a map of how well students are learning based on learning objectives. And we can see that there's one particular objective that's performing poorly. And by clicking on that, we can see the 3 skills tied to that objective. And we recognize that one skill in particular around the characteristics of life is where students are struggling. And so I'm going to click on that, and I'm now able to see all of the places in the course where that particular skill is being covered. And I want to go and maybe I want to edit one of those places and try and improve the content and therefore improve the student performance. I'm going to go to a drop-down menu at the top of our page. You can see we're now in editing mode. So the authoring tools that I referred to in the platform are now available for us and our teams at Acrobatiq, but also for universities and their faculty and or instructional teams. And so I want to create, let's say, a new A/B test. I want to test whether my new explanation that I'm going to create helps students learn more effectively than the original explanation in the courseware. So I go ahead and I create the new A/B test, and then I use the inline editing tools to do something, as simple as I'm going to type a replacement paragraph. I read this, I thought, this paragraph is not that clear, so I use the tools to type in my own paragraph, and then I want to go ahead and add that selection to the course. You can now see there's the original paragraph, that's condition A, and there's the new paragraph, that's the one I just typed, called condition B. Maybe I want to add in a video explanation as well, so I can insert a video, go ahead and use my laptop or my desktop to create that video. And maybe I want that video to be of me explaining to students why this area is tricky and some things to watch out for from my experience in previous years. And then I go ahead and insert that video along with my new explanation. I can now do a couple simple things to configure my test, create it, and go ahead and start my A/B test. What's now going to happen is that half the group of the next students coming through will be randomly assigned the original page. That's the condition A. The other half will be randomly assigned condition B. That's my new paragraph and my video explanation. And then I'll be able to go into see any tests that I'm running at any one time, and I can also be given an alert to see if the new condition B is outperforming the original condition A. So here's the learning objective students were struggling with. There's the skill characteristics of life, and we can see that condition A is indeed worse than condition B, or put another way, my new explanation, condition B, is now helping students learn more effectively. Our system will tell how many students are participated, and will make a recommendation once statistical significance has been reached. And so our recommendation here is, of course, use condition B content. And by selecting that, you would now deploy only condition B to groups of students in the future. And now we can go back to that original view. Here's the learning objective that we were concerned about, and it now turns out to be one of the top performing objectives. And we can keep picking off one objective at a time and keep improving student learning through data. I want to talk about one more interesting example. I talked earlier about learning curve analysis. This is something that you might. We don't want you to have to be a cognitive scientist to be able to leverage to use our tools and platform to improve student performance. So here's another view. It's a heat map of a course where it shows that there's a problem in Module 3. Students are struggling. And by clicking on that, I now can see that there's a learning objective and a skill that students are really struggling with. I'm going to click on that. And here we're actually getting some automated learning curve analysis. What we know is that we should see a curve that looks like this. That represents a smooth learning curve, or a power law of learning. What we're getting from the students in our class is this red one, and we're getting an alert. And what we know is that certain types of learning curves generally mean certain things. And so what we can recommend to the person who's responsible for this course is that this usually means that there's been two skills conflated into one, and that they should really be two separate things. The reason students are struggling is they're encountering something new in the middle of their practice. So you need to separate the skills in the skill graph into two separate skills. Review and update the content to make sure that you have content explaining both skills, and then make sure the activities are there to allow students to practice against them. And then you can go ahead and save that and see how students do. And so we can see the original curve, and now we can see in our data the smooth curve. It's just another example of students, our ability to use the data to continuously optimize student learning. And now to wrap up and conclude, I just want to talk for a moment about how this type of courseware is being used, because I think it's dangerous to assume that it's only for a certain type of learner or a certain type of environment. What we are seeing across OLI data and also now across Acrobatiq data is that this kind of courseware is frequently used in multiple contexts and modalities. It's not so much about whether the course is online, a place-based course. It's really more about how much learning impact are you striving to have, and how much change are you willing to endure as a faculty member, as an institution. And based on that, we see very different levels of usage. None of them necessarily better than the other. They're just different. And so, for example, we see a lot of faculty who are simply saying, hey, this is a better learning experience for my students than a static textbook. They get to be active, they get to engage, they stop and practice frequently. The students getting targeted feedback immediately while they're away from the classroom. This is a better experience. So all I'm going to do is assign this courseware instead of that textbook. And through that change, I make a positive impact on the student learning in my class, and I didn't have to change much else about my practice or the classroom at all. Perfectly valid approach. We see people leveraging the courseware to gain teaching insights. So this would be, for example, what I showed earlier. I can see between Monday and Wednesday that students are struggling with a particular learning outcome. So I start my class on Wednesday with a discussion about that particular learning outcome and review it again to make sure that students are benefiting. Another teaching insight might simply be that I recognize that there's 7 students who are all struggling with the same thing, and I send out an automated email from the system saying, I'm going to be holding office hours today on this, or I'm willing to do an online tutorial if anybody wants to join me at 3 p.m. this afternoon. So this is sort of using the data to get some insights, address some problems, and change the practice of the classroom a little bit, but not a lot, and gain greater learning impact. Then we move over to the world of instructional innovation. This is where somebody's more committed to trying to teach differently. We might think about this as sort of the arena of, for example, of the overused term, the flipped classroom. So I can now assign this work to be done to convey a lot of the foundational knowledge of a course when the student's away from the course, and free up time, for example, for students to engage in activity-based learning, project-based learning, group work, etc., when they're in the classroom with me circulating as a coach or a guide to help those groups perform their tasks effectively. So this kind of courseware allows for that kind of classroom. Not only can I assign some of this foundational work when I'm away from the class or when they're away, but I can also see how they're doing. I can make sure that they're performing well so that we can build on that knowledge in class. I could group students who are struggling with similar things together in the classroom to work on a project together so that I can work more closely with that group. So lots of ways to use the courseware and the data to innovate in the classroom, change the practice even further, and get some greater impact on learning. And ultimately, the highest impact on learning is where there's sort of systemic innovation at work, where an institution and its faculty are saying, we want to tackle a problem. We have a pre-calculus course, we have historically low pass rates, or a chemistry course where 48% of our students are completing successfully. And we want to address that systemically. Maybe we want to pair faculty with TAs and turn those TAs from reactive to proactive tutors. And so maybe the faculty member plays the role of lecture and course designer, and the TAs play the role of monitoring dashboards by section of students and constantly reaching out to individuals on a daily basis before those students fall into a bad cycle, saying, I can see you're struggling with this, can I help you with that? So all of a sudden reorganizing the way that data is being used, the structure of the course delivery itself, maybe the human resources involved in that delivery based on this type of courseware and data is a systemic approach to solving a problem and improving learning outcomes even further. So with that, I'll conclude the basic overview of Acrobatiq. I thank you so much for your time and for your interest. Again, my name is Eric Frank. I am the founder and co-founder and CEO. You can always reach me. My email is Eric, E-R-I-C, at Acrobatiq, ACROBATIQ.com. Again, Eric at Acrobatiq.com. Thank you and have a great day.